Hi everybody, it's Rebecca Virginia, and today I have some fun Easter DIYs to share with you. I think that these will look great up all spring long, so they are great transitional DIYs. Make sure to hit the subscribe button down below if you haven't already, and the notification bell so that you never miss out on a future video. Now let's get started with the first Easter DIY. The first DIY in today's video is an indoor pedestal birdhouse. Here is everything that you'll need to make this DIY on your own. To start off this DIY, I'm taking one of the wood birdhouses from the Crafter's Square section of the Dollar Tree. I've seen these birdhouses many times and walked by them and didn't pick them up because I couldn't think of a DIY to do with them. So finally I was like, I'm going to pick it up and come up with a DIY. So I'm starting off just by painting my birdhouse entirely in white. I knew I wanted to do something with the roof, but I figured I would just paint the entire thing first, and then I could figure out from there if I wanted to use paint or some scrapbooking paper. And I did take a smaller detailed brush to go underneath the roof and around the little knobs on the birdhouse and get inside the crevices. I was really inspired by these paper plates at the Dollar Tree. I use a couple different ones throughout today's video, and I just loved the vibrant colors and how springy it looked, and it really got me in the mood to use some brighter colors. So I painted part of the birdhouse with this almost periwinkle, it's like a purpley blue color. And then this is a fence that I had from a Christmas, it wasn't a nativity scene, but it was like a little Christmas village scene. And the Christmas village has long since gone, but I kept this fence just knowing that I was going to use it for a DIY one day. So I knew I wanted to put this fence on the birdhouse, and I painted it that matching periwinkle color that I painted on the little bird ledges on the birdhouse. I always get my scrapbooking paper at Hobby Lobby. They always have it on sale for $1, and I saw this color and I thought it really matched with that bluish purple that I was going for. Today's whole video has a lot of purpley elements. I was just feeling the lavender, the spring, and that color was really speaking to me, so I decided to go with this for my birdhouse roof. Usually I always use Mod Podge when I'm using scrapbooking paper, but I had actually forgot that I had this spray adhesive in my glue drawer, so I figured I would bring this out and see if it worked as well as I remembered, and it really does. I didn't have to worry about the wetness of Mod Podge or any of it crinkling. The only downside is this stuff is so sticky, so if you get it anywhere besides where you want to on your project, you have to be really careful because it is going to stick everywhere. But once I sprayed down my adhesive, I was able to adhere the scrapbooking paper to both sides of the roof. And I did decide that I was going to paint the little awnings on the roof, not add scrapbooking paper there. So it made it a lot easier because I didn't have to cut out smaller pieces for that part. Once my fence was all dry, I cut it in half just so that I could work around this little bird ledge on the house. So I cut that in half, and then I just used hot glue to adhere it down. And I did have the two little fence posts kind of sticking out, so I just went in with some of my miter shears and just cut those off. I ended up not using this little bird figurine that I got in a fairy garden set from the Dollar Tree. I thought it ended up being a little bit too big for the birdhouse, but I did just want to keep it in the video and show you because I do think a little bird figurine would be really cute there if you found one small enough. Then I sanded the inner parts of the birdhouse because some of the wood was chipping out, and I took a light blue color that matched the roof but was still lighter than the fence color, and I just painted that little portion of the roof that the scrapbooking paper didn't cover. Next, I took a glass candlestick holder and I painted that with some white chalk paint, and I did have to use a couple of layers just because it was a little bit harder to paint on the glass. Also, if you're not able to find these candlestick holders at your Dollar Tree, I also think that you could put the birdhouse on a wood dowel and then place the wood dowel in a clay pot. That would be a really cute look too. I know these candlestick holders can be a little bit hard to find, so that's another option. The final step is really easy. You're just going to place some hot glue on top of the glass candlestick holder, then get the birdhouse in the position that you like on top and press down. This piece will definitely add a touch of spring to your home decor, and I love being able to incorporate a birdhouse on the inside of your house instead of the outside. Next, I'm going to show you how to make and style your very own bird's nest. Here's everything you need to complete your nest. And we're going to start off this DIY by me showing you how to make the nest. So I took a brown paper bag and then I cut off one end just so I had a little less to work with. And then I just started going all the way around the brown paper bag and started rolling it down. It is a little bit hard just because you don't want to rip the brown paper bag, but once you get the hang of it, you just roll it all the way down until it kind of has this nest formation. Then for the next part, I did put on a pair of plastic gloves because the feeling of the wet Spanish moss with the Mod Podge is kind of gross. I didn't like it. So I went ahead and put on a pair of gloves, and all that you're going to do is line all around that brown paper bag formation with some Mod Podge and then stick on some Spanish moss. And you're just going to continue doing this, building up the layers. At first, I felt like it wasn't working and everything was sliding around, but once the Mod Podge dries, you'll be able to see that everything does stay in place really well. So I just kept doing the technique of layering Mod Podge, then moss, Mod Podge, then moss. And towards the end, I was a little sick of that technique, and I thought maybe a faster way to do it is to just dip the Spanish moss straight into the Mod Podge and then lay it down, and that worked too. So I did that with the top layer. I think either way would be fine. And then once you have pretty successfully built your nest, again, it doesn't look super pretty because of the Mod Podge, but once it dries, it really does look nice. And then you can see that I'm kind of just forming it and molding it with my hands to get it in a nice circular shape. Also, if you have any unruly Spanish moss that's sticking out, you can always go in with a pair of scissors after it's dried and cut off any pieces that are really sticking out. I let my little bird nest dry for 24 hours before I touched it again. So the next day I moved on to the eggs that are going to be going in our little DIY bird nest. I got these styrofoam eggs from the Dollar Tree, and then I just took 3 toothpicks and placed them in the styrofoam eggs. After painting them this light purple lavender color, I stuck the toothpicks down into some floral foam so that the eggs could fully dry. To give my eggs a speckled effect, I took some dark brown paint and a large fluffy paintbrush, and I just loaded up my paintbrush with a lot of brown paint, and then I pulled the bristles back, and it gave this really sporadic, kind of uneven, freckled look. Now that it has been over 24 hours, our nest has perfectly dried, and I even took some twigs that I found outside and added those into the nest as well. And I'm just checking to make sure that the 3 eggs fit, but I'm not going to glue those down yet, because now is the time to add all of my greenery and floral arrangements. I really liked these spring florals that the Dollar Tree just came out with. There's tons of greenery and little bits of purple and lavender, and I thought that went perfectly with the eggs, so I just put a bunch of florals in the back of the nest. Once I was happy with my selection and placement of florals, I went ahead and placed those in the nest. I was able to just kind of push them down into the nest, but you could also add a little bit of hot glue on any pieces that might need it. And I did place my eggs back into the nest just to see how they looked next to the florals, but I never glued them down, so now it's time to do that, and I'm just using some hot glue to adhere them to the nest. I absolutely love how this nest came out. I think it looks so realistic, and I love the pop of purple. The next DIY is a Bless Our Nest hanging sign. Here's everything that you'll need to recreate this. I started off this DIY by taking a wood sign that I got all the way back in October, and then I grabbed some white chalk paint and I just painted the entirety of the back of our sign. I am going to be covering this with a calendar page, but I wanted all of the back to be white because the calendar pages are pretty thin and I didn't want you being able to see the brown bits peeking through. I'm going to be using the September page from the Simply Blessed calendar. I thought the Bless Our Nest phrase went perfect with our indoor birdhouse and the bird's nest that we made. And all I did was lay our sign on top of it and traced it out, then cut the Bless Our Nest calendar page. I thought the calendar page would have looked really pretty if I had cut it going vertical on the wood sign as well, but I decided to go with the horizontal look. So once I placed it down, I could have used some Mod Podge to adhere it, but the calendar pages were so thin and I was really scared that it would rip with Mod Podge, so I just used that spray glue again and sprayed it and then gently laid down the calendar page and smoothed out any bubbles just in case any formed with an old gift card. To add a rustic touch to this sign, I took some dark brown paint and used a dry brushing technique to paint all along the edges of our sign. And right now my sign looks a little weird because obviously the calendar image didn't fill up the entire wood sign. So to kind of fix that, what I'm doing is taking some of this green and white garland. It's so pretty. I got it in the fall time, but I've also seen it recently. I think they're bringing it back out for spring. And if you had a lot of it, you could just wrap it around, but this is the only bit of garland that I have. So to save it, I cut it in the back just so that I could really use as much of it as possible and I don't need it in the back. And then I just hot glued it down and I ended up doing 3 strands of the green and white garland on each side. And once I placed down the garland, the sign was starting to look better, but I still just felt like it was too white on the edges and something was missing. So I ended up going back in with my brown paint and a paintbrush, and I just distressed it even further. I wanted it to look more rustic and not so new and clean. So I added some brown paint to the sides, and I even added it to the top and bottom of the sign as well. Something was still a tiny bit off to me, and I knew a nice sprig of some florals would fix that. So I went ahead and added in some little white florals to the bottom right corner. And then to hang it, because I covered up the holes that were originally there with the calendar page, I just hot glued some jute onto the back to act as the hanger.
And that completes our rustic Bless Our Nest hanging sign. On to the next DIY.
This adorable DIY is a bunny cloche tablescape, and it might be my favorite DIY I've ever made. Here's everything that you'll need to recreate it. I'm beginning this DIY by unwrapping a coaster I got from the Dollar Tree. It doesn't matter the color or what it says because I'm going to be covering the entire thing in a dark brown paint. Next, I took some of this dark green decorative moss from the Dollar Tree, and I'm covering the coaster in the moss. I didn't put a super thick layer down because I still want a little bit of the coaster to show through, but this is going to be a habitat for the bunny, so I wanted it to be fairly covered. The bunny I'm using is a ceramic bunny from the Dollar Tree, and it's intended for kids to paint, but I have another use for him. I'm leaving him his original white color, and I tried to remove the hook from the top of his head, and at first I couldn't get it out and I accidentally chipped the top of his head, but then I grabbed some smaller needle nose pliers and I was able to finally pull out the metal ring from the top of his head. After placing down the bunny into our tablescape, I wanted to add some florals around the moss to add a little pop of color, so I chose these bright yellow flowers. I added just one, and I was going to add another, but I thought some more taller greenery might add some nice depth to the tablescape, so I went ahead and added that behind the bunny. As I went along adding more embellishments to the tablescape, I kept placing the glass jar over the scene just to make sure everything fit underneath it. I thought my bunny needed a little more color since I left him white instead of painting him, so I decided to take some light blue baker's twine from the Crafter's Square section, and I hot glued it around his neck, and then I added a tiny bow. I took a glass ball topper from a glass bottle that I got at the Dollar Tree, and this is going to go on top of the bunny cloche. There was this rubber all around the bottom of the topper, so to cover it up while keeping everything nice and cohesive, I took that same light blue baker's twine and wrapped it all the way around the topper. The last step is to hot glue our topper down onto our glass jar. You could also use E6000 if you wanted it to be a little bit more secure, but I like the hot glue because it dries faster. Then I placed the glass jar over my bunny and my tablescape was complete. DIY in today's video is a bunny nest. Here's what you need to make it. Starting off this DIY, I am taking this large styrofoam bunny out of its plastic. Then I'm going to be decoupaging the bunny with, instead of tissue paper, some napkins from the Dollar Tree. So I went ahead and removed those as well. And this is the only tricky part of working with napkins when you're decoupaging. It was a 2-ply napkin and it was extremely hard to take the 2 plies apart from one another. So I found that by ripping it and kind of making that jagged edge, That was the easiest way that I could pull apart the 2 plies. I'm used to working with tissue paper, so you don't really have to do this step, but you definitely want to do this, otherwise it won't lay down flat on your bunny if you're working with a thick napkin like this. I also thought that the easiest way to do this, instead of working in large pieces, I was just going to cut out some strips and then make those into smaller squares to then adhere to my bunny. The next part is extremely easy, but a little bit time consuming. And all that I'm doing is laying down my napkin squares and then covering it in Mod Podge and moving on. Because I chose this bright plaid pattern, I knew there was no way I was going to get all the plaid in the same direction, and I didn't really want to. I wanted it to be a hodgepodge of all sorts of different directions and colors, so I just had fun and went in with all the different napkin squares and just placed them down wherever I wanted on the bunny. The only slightly difficult part about doing this is when you get to the bunny's ears and a little bit around his face, so just make sure to be extra careful and not add too much Mod Podge, otherwise the napkin will tear. Okay, now it's time to start building our bunny wreath scene. So I am taking one of these oven covers from the Dollar Tree. I had spray painted it brown for another project that didn't end up working out, and all I'm doing is placing this underneath our grapevine wreath. You could also just use a paper plate. The sole purpose of this oven cover is just to catch any of the Spanish moss that is going to be falling through our little bunny nest. So again, you can just use a paper plate, a paper towel, really anything. It just so happened that I had this oven cover and it actually fit perfectly. Now that we have filled our grapevine wreath up with all of this Spanish moss, I am just kind of molding out a little section so that my bunny can go ahead and fit perfectly inside of the wreath. The last part is the most fun part, and that is just adding all of the florals and little embellishments into our bunny nest. I put those jute carrots again on some toothpicks and placed those in our nest, and then I just got a bunch of florals and greenery and started placing them all around our bunny and all around the grapevine wreath. Once you're done adding all of the embellishments you want to your bunny nest, you are ready to display it. You can leave the oven cover underneath the wreath in case you want to collect any stray Spanish moss, or you can remove it. The next DIY in today's video is an egg-shaped display shelf. Here's everything that you'll need to complete this DIY on your own. I'm actually going to be using the plain back of the sign in this DIY. I didn't want the glittery words to be showing, so I just painted over them. You could either paint over them, cover it in craft paper, or if you don't mind them, you could just leave it as is. But I knew that I was going to be displaying this in my home, so I didn't want one side to be wood and one side to have all those glittery words, so I just painted over it. The side of our sign that I'm going to be using, which was originally the back, is now going to be the front. And I took some of this wood scrapbooking paper that I got from Hobby Lobby, and I just used a regular old glue stick. I usually use Mod Podge, but I've been really liking just using a plain old glue stick, and I find that it works just as well. So I just put the glue down and then used an old gift card to smooth out any bubbles just in case they formed. One sheet of the scrapbooking paper didn't quite cover my egg sign, so I went ahead and took the top part of another sheet, and I just traced this out and then cut it and used the exact same method using the glue stick to place this little extra bit of the wood scrapbooking paper down. Now that my egg sign was all covered in the scrapbooking paper, I moved on to making the shelves for this sign. And to use this, I'm taking some wood blocks from the Tumbling Tower toys at the Dollar Tree, and I'm just covering them in some brown paint. I only did about 1 drop per block, and I found when I did this, it kind of made the paint look more like a stain because it really needed more to be fully opaque. So this was a really fast and easy way to kind of make a stain, just use less paint. My job for laying down where I wanted the shelves was actually kind of easy because I just followed the wood grain on the scrapbooking paper, and I ended up doing a little bit staggered shelving. So I did 2 to the left side and 1 to the right, and again I just used the wood grain in the scrapbooking paper as my guide for where I needed to place my little wood shelves. I used hot glue to adhere the Tumbling Tower blocks to my egg sign, and that worked perfectly. It held them in place and they weren't moving at all. Next, it's time to start decorating our shelves. I knew on one of the shelves I wanted to have some eggs, so I have these styrofoam little mini eggs from the Dollar Tree, and I painted one in this robin's egg blue color, and then one I painted white. Next, I'm starting to lay out how I want to style my DIY. So I took some felt carrot stickers, a moss bunny, and my 2 styrofoam eggs, and I'm just laying them down on the shelves and seeing how I like them, and if I like a lot of the Spanish moss, if I like a little, or if I don't like it at all. Then for my moss bunny, I added on a little jute bow and a little flower next to him, and then I was happy with how everything was placed, so I got out my hot glue gun and started gluing down the moss and all of the little embellishments for the shelves. You could absolutely use this egg sign as a hanging sign, but for me, I wanted it to be more of a stand-up, standalone piece of decor in my house, so that is why I didn't add any like jute hanger or a little string up at the top, but you could still definitely do that. However, I wanted to make my piece of decor into a freestanding shelf. I decided to take this wood block sign. I picked mine up during the fall time. I know they had a bunch out during Christmas, and I've seen some new ones out for Valentine's Day and Easter, so definitely pick them up if you see them. And all I'm doing is taking one of the tumbling tower blocks and hot gluing it to our display shelf. And then once that is dry, I'm going to hot glue the tumbling tower block down onto the larger wood block sign. After pressing down firmly to make sure I had my egg shelf nice and centered, I thought that I needed to add a little something extra, and I remembered that I had this set of Easter spring themed galvanized signs, and I really liked the welcome one. I thought it would look really cute with this display shelf, so I went ahead and hot glued that right onto the wood block. The other great thing about this egg-shaped display shelf is you don't have to hot glue the items down that go onto the shelves, and that way you can change them out to easier transition from spring to Easter. The Easter themed DIY in today's video is a bunny carrot sack. Here's everything you'll need to make your own. I started off by painting this wood dowel in a dark brown color and then setting it aside to dry. Then I took one of these brown fabric bunny sacks, and we're actually not going to be using it for the bunny face, so I just turned it inside out. They also came out with these for Christmas, so if you have one of those, that works too because we are turning it inside out. And make sure you cut off the tag on the inside. Don't pull and rip it because it will tear the seams out of the side. Next, I'm taking some floral foam, and I'm kind of just guesstimating, but I figured I wanted about halfway up the length of the brown sack, so I just kind of guessed, and then I took my scissors and very professionally I sliced through the floral foam. And you might be wondering, why didn't I take the plastic off the floral foam before I cut it? And that's actually because it's really hard to get floral foam into fabric, particularly fabric bags like this one. So by leaving the plastic on, it slid super easily right down into my brown sack. And then you could really just leave the plastic in there, but I just put my hand down there and pulled it out. Now moving on to the items going inside of our bunny carrot sack. So first off, we have to have the actual bunny. I loved this moss bunny that the Dollar Tree came out with. It's so cute, so I hot glued that to the top of the wood dowel that we had painted earlier. Then I really loved these jute carrots from the Dollar Tree, and I didn't want to put a dowel on them because they were so skinny down at the bottom. So I found that toothpicks actually worked great. So I went ahead and put the toothpicks in the carrots, and then it was just all about arranging how my carrots and bunny were going to go into the sack. I kind of wanted the 2 carrots on the outside at an angle. Then I was just playing around with how I would be closing up our sack and what that would look like. Then once I figured the height that I wanted the bunny on the dowel to be, I cut off any of the excess dowel, and I just put the bunny right down in the center of the floral foam. And now again, I'm just playing around with the sack, figuring out how scrunched I want it to be before tying it off with a piece of jute, and then I added a little bow. To make our sack full of carrots and our bunny a little more realistic looking, I wanted to add some Spanish moss onto that top area of the sack so it looked like the carrots really were growing inside of it. I wasn't sure how much moss I wanted to use, so I went ahead and just placed it down first before I got out the hot glue gun and started gluing it down onto the sack. Our bunny was looking a little plain, and I wanted to tie in the orange and the carrots, so Dollar Tree had this awesome little carrot ribbon with gold trim, and I loved it, but it was a little bit too thick for our tiny bunny, so I just folded the ribbon in half and then made a bow that way and just hot glued it down onto the front of our bunny. To add more of a rustic touch, I wanted to write carrots 5 cents on the front of the sack. I don't have the best handwriting, but this actually came in handy because I wanted this to look extremely homemade and kind of like a bunny wrote it because he wanted some carrots. I don't know, but either way, I just wanted it to look really homemade, very rustic, so my not so good handwriting kind of came in handy. Then my pen wasn't quite thick enough for this sack, so I just went over the carrots 5 cents with some black paint. The first DIY in today's video is an egg tree topiary. Here's everything that you need to make this DIY on your own. The first step in this DIY is painting all of our colorful plastic eggs. But I figured you guys probably knew how to paint, so I went ahead and used some editing magic and painted the eggs for you. I used a pale pink, blue, and purple color. Next, I am taking my foam cone, and instead of hot gluing the eggs directly onto the cone, first I wasn't sure exactly what pattern or what kind of colors that I wanted to put on the cone and how I wanted them to look, so I just took some glue dots. You could also just take some tape, especially if it's double-sided tape, and I'm just kind of laying them out, trying to kind of eyeball how I'm liking them formed, how many it's going to take. Spoiler alert, I needed more eggs, so you see me put some of the really bright plastic ones back onto this tree, but this is really just for me seeing how I'm going to plan out my egg tree. As I mentioned earlier, you can see that I ran out of my painted eggs, so I'm just placing down those really bright plastic ones as a placeholder for me to kind of eyeball how my egg tree is forming. But in the meantime, I went ahead and took my glue gun and started gluing down those eggs that were already painted. Once I had painted a couple more of those plastic eggs, I went ahead and hot glued them all onto our foam cone. The next step is adding all of this Spanish moss into the spaces where the eggs aren't touching. So essentially we're trying to create our egg tree and have it very mossy. So I just took a bit of hot glue and placed it onto a clump of the Spanish moss. And then I just pushed the Spanish moss in between some eggs and adhered it onto our foam cone. And I ended up just doing this all the way around the egg, and in some of the tighter spots, even using hot glue wasn't really necessary because the spaces were so small, it kind of just held the Spanish moss into place as is. But you can kind of tell once you start working which places will need glue and maybe some that won't need it. After I had added all of the moss in between my eggs, I wanted them to have a speckled effect. So I loaded up a paintbrush with some brown paint, and then I just started tapping it on my wrist to create this really beautiful splatter effect. You can also achieve this effect just by pulling the bristles back on the paintbrush, but I really like this tapping method because it gave a little bit more of a delicate look to the freckles. Then I took this planter from the Dollar Tree, and I found this in the garden section and really liked the texture on the planter. Then I just took some white chalk paint and I went all the way around the planter twice, just covering it in this white chalk paint. And of course, I couldn't just leave it plain white. I had to distress it a little bit, so I'm just taking this small piece of sandpaper and going all the way around our planter, lightly sanding off in certain sections, especially where we have that raised texture on our planter. In order for our topiary tree to be raised in the planter, we have to first fill it with some of this floral foam. So I'm just taking this, again, this is all from the Dollar Tree, and I'm just placing it in the center of our planter and then cutting off smaller sections and creating a raised surface for our topiary tree. And every once in a while I would put the tree on top just to see if I was going in the right direction. I wanted it to be raised enough so you could still see that bottom layer of eggs, but I also didn't want it to be completely out of the planter. I wanted a small bit of the egg to be covered. And once I have laid down all of my floral foam and I have a nice flat surface for our topiary tree to go on top of, I went ahead and started hot gluing some of this Spanish moss around the outside layer of our planter and floral foam. Then to adhere our egg topiary tree onto our planter, I went ahead and just put down some hot glue on top of the floral foam and on the bottom of our foam cone, and then I carefully just placed this down onto the planter, and some of that Spanish moss got in the way, so I had to move it out. And then I just held it in place to make sure that everything was adhered and the hot glue dried. Then there were a few small areas where the topiary tree met the planter that weren't covered in Spanish moss, so I just went ahead and took some of this scrap Spanish moss and hot glued that so none of the foam cone was showing through. And I didn't film it, but you'll see in the finished clip, I did add a few small pieces of baby's breath to the topiary tree. I love how this egg topiary came out. I think I might leave it up all spring, not just for Easter. If you make it on your own, let me know in the comments below. Next up are some quick and easy to make sprouting tulips. Here's the supplies you'll need to recreate it. I'm starting off this DIY by painting this wood palette that I got from the Dollar Tree, and I'm actually using a stain from Waverly. I just wet a paper towel, put the stain on the paper towel, and rubbed it into the wood. This is going to be what our sprouting tulips are sitting on. I wanted the eggs to look like they were really growing from the ground, so to do this, I put an egg on the wood palette and I just kind of twirled it around, and that's how I knew how high up the egg I wanted to put the brown paint. I obviously didn't want it to come up too far, but I still wanted you to be able to see the brown paint when I later on am going to hot glue them down onto the wood palette. Once the paint had dried on the eggs, it was time to attach the tulips to them. And I found that the easiest way to do this was to actually place them back into the container that the Dollar Tree originally sold them in. So I just put them back in the container, and then it was really great because my eggs weren't rolling around and trying to get away from me. And when I first started this, I had taken a power drill and I tried to drill a hole in the top of the eggs, but I could not get through it. It was getting a little too difficult, so I figured I was going to try it with hot glue first and then go back to the power drill if I needed to. But luckily for me, the hot glue worked just fine. Now, if you have a stronger power drill than me, or maybe you're just more well-versed in power drills, then you can go ahead and try that. But for me, hot glue was just easier and it was the way to go. I started off by putting a little bit on the top of the egg and then putting the flower down in it. And then it was kind of a waiting game. I think I held each flower for about 5 minutes. So you can see I have my little to-go coffee there because I was just holding these flowers until the hot glue dried. And obviously, if you let go of them before it's dried, the flowers will just fall right off of the eggs. So I put on a YouTube video, I had my coffee, and I just held those flowers for about 5 minutes each. Now, obviously, I had to use quite a bit of hot glue to get the tulips to stay attached to the eggs. So to cover that up and make it really look like the eggs are sprouting the tulips, I hot glued some of this Spanish moss to the top where the egg meets the tulip. I really liked how the brown Spanish moss looked, but I think some reindeer moss would be really pretty too, so you can go with whatever color you like best. Now I'm attaching our sprouting tulips to the wood palette that we had stained earlier, and I decided to go with 2 in the back and then my smaller tulip right in the front. The Dollar Tree has gorgeous florals right now. That's where I found these tulips, but even if you can't find the tulips, I think that you'll be able to easily find another floral to fit this DIY. The next DIY is a rustic Easter egg welcome sign. Here's everything that you need to complete this adorable sign on your own. For this DIY to make our sign, I actually took an old Christmas sign from the Dollar Tree. And this one was really great because the front of it peeled off super easy. But it did leave behind a little bit of residue, so just to be safe, I'm going to be using the back for this DIY. After I pulled off the hanger, there was one staple that just did not want to come out, so after I removed that, I took some of this bare paint, and this was just a sample that I got at Home Depot, and I'm going to be using this as a primer because when I lay down my brown paint, less of it is going to absorb into our sign, so it's just nice to have a good basic primer down before I go ahead and put my brown paint on top and paint the entire sign. Then once the brown paint has dried, I am taking a stippling brush that I got from the Dollar Tree and that same white bare paint sample that I had, And I'm just kind of making lines in it, distressing the sides all around, just dry brushing and trying to make this look distressed and kind of like wood. To write out the word welcome, I don't have good handwriting, so I couldn't just paint it. So instead I made a stencil, which I will be sure to link below. And usually I really like using these large poster board letters from the Dollar Tree. You can put them onto your sign, paint over them, and then when you peel them off, the word will be there. And I know that I've also shown all of you the graphite pencil method of tracing words on and then being able to paint over them. But I thought that I would just try something new, so I laid down the stencil and then took my sponge brush and dabbed the paint over. And in some of the harder to reach areas that the sponge didn't get, I went in with a small precision paintbrush. Once my paint had dried, I gently removed the stencil, and again, because this was paper and not vinyl or something more sticky, it did bleed through, so it wasn't the most perfect stencil, but the good news is it at least put the letters down for me, so then I was able to take a paintbrush and kind of go over them as my guide and clean things up a bit. And this is going to be a rustic sign, so in about 5 seconds I'm going to be going over all of this with sandpaper, and that is going to get out any little mistakes that may have been made from the stencil. Sandpaper is kind of amazing. It works like a magic eraser on those little spots where it looks like the paint had seeped through the stencil. You see me just rub on those little paint marks and they magically disappear. And I just went over our entire sign quite a few times to distress it. Next, I am taking some of this green and white garland from the Dollar Tree. I absolutely love this garland. It's so gorgeous and perfect for spring. And I'm just creating a border with it going all the way around our welcome sign. It wouldn't be a spring or Easter DIY without adding some florals. So I took these bouquets from the Dollar Tree. One had little yellow roses and one was just a bouquet of baby's breath. And I put the baby's breath all the way around the border of the sign and some of those yellow roses. To add a pop of Easter to our sign, I took some styrofoam eggs from the Dollar Tree and freckled them with some brown paint. I did the same with yellow eggs, and then I placed 2 in each bottom corner of our sign and added a little yellow rose to each egg. The last step in our welcome sign is to add a hanger. And I thought jute would go really well with the whole rustic theme, so I just hot glued it to both ends of our welcome hanger. And that completes our rustic Easter egg welcome sign. This DIY in today's video is a bunny house. Here's what you need to make your own. I'm kicking off this DIY by removing the backing of our wood house. It's a little bit difficult at first, but then once you get it, it pops off pretty easily. And then any of this spare paper, I went ahead and removed too. To add a bit of color to my house, I took the Waverly wax and a wet paper towel, and I just applied the wax on the paper towel and then rubbed it into the wood. If you don't have a wax or stain, all that you have to do is dilute some brown paint with a bit of water and you'll have a DIY stain. The centerpiece of this craft is going to be our wood bunny, and I just took it and added a bit of hot glue, and then I'm adding some green reindeer moss and covering my entire wood bunny with this reindeer moss. And if you find that while you're covering the wood bunny with the moss, you begin to lose the shape of the bunny, don't worry, all that you have to do is take a small pair of scissors and trim off any of the moss that's going outside of the bunny's edge, and that way you will retain the shape of the bunny. After covering the wood bunny in moss, I am heading back over to our wood house. And I picked out this really cute purple bunny scrapbooking paper from Hobby Lobby. Again, I know I mentioned it a lot, but Hobby Lobby pretty much always has their scrapbooking paper for $1, so it's a really great deal to pick up your scrapbooking paper there. After I traced it out, I cut it out and then just used a glue stick to adhere our scrapbooking paper to the backing of our house. Then to reattach the house that we took apart earlier, I'm just putting a bit of hot glue all around the edges and pressing it down. I thought our moss bunny was looking a little bare, so I went ahead and made him a bow out of some jute and then hot glued it down. After that, I hot glued the entire bunny down onto the inside of our wooden house. To add some embellishments to our bunny house, I took some Spanish moss and just hot glued it down so it looked like the bunny was sitting in the moss. Then I wanted to add a little bit more embellishment to my bunny house, so I took some styrofoam eggs from the Dollar Tree and I painted them purple and then added a freckle effect by putting paint on a paintbrush and pulling the bristles back. I wanted to include a clip of these rub-on transfers as well because the Dollar Tree does make a taller version of this wood house, and if you picked up the taller version or had a different one that you were making that's a bit bigger than mine, I think it'd be really cute to add in some lettering that says Happy Easter or Hello Spring. But because mine is smaller, I am just hot gluing down the egg in the bottom left corner. And that completes our bunny house DIY. Please leave in the comment section down below any DIY that you're planning to try. I'm starting off this spring DIY video with a window frame wreath bunny. To create your own faux window and complete this DIY, here are all the supplies that you'll need. To begin this DIY, I am taking 4 of these canvases from the Crafter's Square section of the Dollar Tree, and I'm just ripping off the actual canvases so that we are left with these 4 wood frames. The canvases are really easy to rip off, so you don't need any special tools to remove any of this. Then when I had my 4 wood frames, I began to stain them. So I'm taking the Waverly Stain in Antique and a wet paper towel and just going all the way around our wood frames. And I didn't want to do too much because our wreath is going to be brown, so I don't want a super dark frame, so I'm just lightly putting the wax on and rubbing it in. I played with the idea of using 2 picture frames instead of 4 canvases, but ultimately I went with the canvases, and I'm really happy that I did because the 4 of these put together with some hot glue really gives the illusion of a window, which is exactly what I was going for in this DIY. Then I took the galvanized bunny from a previous Easter sign at the Dollar Tree that I showed earlier in the supplies section, and I absolutely love this galvanized bunny, and I'll definitely be using the wood sign for a future DIY. Then I am taking a wreath. This came in a set of 2, and I'm using the smaller one. And I just hot glued the bunny behind the wreath, and I'm taking some floral picks from the spring collection at the Dollar Tree. I absolutely love the new florals that they came out with this spring, if I haven't said that enough already. So I'm just taking my scissors and cutting off some of the leaves and then sticking them into our wreath. One of the floral picks also came with these little yellow, they kind of look like seeds or flowers, and I thought that added a nice pop of color to kind of break up all of the browns, so I went ahead and cut some of those off and hot glued them into the wreath as well. I hot glued the back of the bunny and the wreath down onto our canvas frames, and then as a final touch to add a bit more of decor to our DIY, I took some burlap ribbon from the Dollar Tree and I made a large bow and hot glued that to the top. If you see burlap ribbon at your Dollar Tree, definitely pick it up. I couldn't find hardly any during the winter, but I've seen quite a bit during the spring, so definitely stock up. And the last part of this DIY was to add a hanger, and I decided to go with jute because I thought it fit the rustic, kind of earthy feel of this DIY, so I went ahead and just hot glued the jute onto the back. The other great thing about this DIY is if you want to make it an interchangeable sign, you can. You just wouldn't hot glue down the bunny and the wreath. You could add some double-sided tape or even a hook that you could hang it on, and then you could change it out for every season and change up the wreath and the little decor in the center. The next DIY is a Bless Our Nest easel. Here's everything that you need to recreate this project on your own. To begin this DIY, I'm doing some staining and painting. I took my Waverly Wax and Antique and a wet paper towel, and I'm just staining these tumbling tower blocks that are found in the children's toy section of the Dollar Tree. Then I found this dry erase easel in the Crafter's Square section, so anywhere that there is wood, I am using that stain. And I actually originally didn't realize this was a dry erase board. I thought it was a canvas, so to get rid of that shine and create a nice even base, I just used some white chalk paint. This adorable bunny image is from the back preview section of a calendar from the Dollar Tree, and this is going to be the center point of our DIY. And in that little preview picture of our bunny and wreath, you can see that there is a faux shiplap element, so that's why I laid the picture down first so that I could kind of try to follow the lines in the picture. Then I'm just adhering it down with a bit of spray adhesive, again trying to line up those lines, but it didn't have to be perfect because once I put it down, I went over it again with some brown paint and that stippling brush to make everything blend. Once the wax had dried on the tumbling tower blocks, I hot glued 2 to the top and 2 to the bottom of our easel. I didn't like all of the blank space on the sides of our easel, so I took some floral picks from the Dollar Tree and hot glued those down. I also added some Spanish moss from the Crafter's Square section to the bottom of each of our florals. And the longer that I stood looking at it, the more I thought it was a little bit too busy and maybe too much. So I wanted to cut down on some of the florals, so here I am just basically taking all of the florals back off and instead settling for just 2 yellow roses on the ends. I don't plan on hanging this up, but I wanted to make a little tag for the top of our easel using some jute, and then I just hot glued it to the back. I also ended up putting Bless Our Nest onto the easel. But you can always customize this with any saying or phrase of your choosing. Once I saw these vibrant jute carrots at the Dollar Tree, I knew I had to make a DIY with them. Here are the other supplies you'll need to make this. This DIY is super quick and easy. We are first starting off with this shadow box from the Dollar Tree, and originally I planned to use a plaid scrapbooking paper inside, but I thought it was a little bit too busy, so instead I decided to go with this shiplap print. So I just traced it out and then cut it, and then I just used a bit of spray adhesive to adhere everything down onto the backing of our shadow box. I pick up my scrapbooking paper Wendy's for $1 over at Hobby Lobby. Then once that had dried, I am just popping back up the shadow box and I'm about to put it back into its frame. But first, I don't want it to be white on white, so I took some dark brown paint and I'm painting the frame of our shadow box, and then I'm going to put everything back together. I want this DIY to say "Every Bunny Welcome," and if you have good handwriting or no calligraphy, you can go ahead and just write it down, or you can use some of these rub-on transfers for the Dollar Tree, but I went ahead and used some vinyl. With my "Every Bunny Welcome" now adhered down onto my DIY, the last step was to add in my Dollar Tree jute carrots. I absolutely love these and cannot believe that they are from the Dollar Tree. They are such high quality, and I went ahead and put down 3 to make a little carrot bunch. I also love this plaid pastel ribbon, so to create a nice little centerpiece on our middle carrot there, I made a bow and then hot glued it down onto the carrot. Similar to my previous DIY, I really liked the look of a jute loop at the top of the project, so I added that. This is a super quick and easy DIY to bring a bit of Easter decor into your home. DIY may be small, but it brings a bright pop of spring to any tiered tray. Here are the supplies that you'll need to make this. For this spring DIY, I am actually going to be using a Christmas ornament. So the Dollar Tree sold these during Christmas time. They are little I don't even know what you would call it, a little Christmas door with a wreath on it, and they are ornament sized. So I wanted to turn this into a spring DIY and something you could either put on an Easter egg tree or on a tiered tray. So I started off by sanding off the glitter, and then I just took some white chalk paint and I am covering up all of that red. Then to distress it, I took a bit of brown paint and a stippling brush and just went in and distressed all around the edges and the outside of the door. The original doorknob was a jewel, but instead of using that, I took a fence. This is actually from a Christmas village that I used to have, so I'm keeping with that Christmas theme. And I just cut it off of the fence and I'm painting it brown, and this is going to be our new door handle for our spring door. I'm going to be making a new spring wreath for this door, and I liked that the original door ornament had this wreath form. So I just trimmed it down and then took some sprigs of boxwood and I just hot glued those around the already made wreath form. After my wreath was formed, I wanted to add a little bit of color, so I took some floral picks that I got from the Dollar Tree, and I think these were supposed to be lavender, so I just cut off a couple of pieces and stuck those down into the wreath with some hot glue, and I really liked the pop of purple that it added. To make a faux wood sign for our door, I took a piece of cardstock and just cut out a rectangle shape to make it a sign, and I did take a bit of my Waverly wax paint to stain it brown. Then I wanted to write the saying, "Hello Spring," and to do this, I didn't do anything fancy or use any special writing utensils. I just took a regular pen and wrote out in cursive, "Hello Spring." Once my new door handle was dried, I cut off the top of the fence post with some of my miter shears. I'll link these down below if you guys want to purchase them. And then I just added a bit of hot glue to adhere it to our door. And I did the same thing with the wreath and the sign, just taking a bit of hot glue to place everything down onto the door. One of the final touches on decorating the actual door was to add a small jute bow to the top of our wreath. For the hanger, instead of using my usual jute, I took some green floral wire that I got from the Dollar Tree near the Crafter Square section, and I wanted it to be curly down by the door, so I just wrapped it around a marker to create those spirals, and then I just hooked it through and cut off any of the excess floral wire. Spring DIY is a garden gate bunny. Here are all the supplies you'll need to recreate this DIY on your own. This piece of bunny home decor can be used inside the home or outside the home. But if you're going to be using it inside, you will need something for your fence to sit on, so that is why I took one of these wood planks from the Dollar Tree and I'm painting it brown. The Dollar Tree sells these really beautiful, ornate looking, but plastic fences. So I am going to just use one panel of this fence, so I'm taking my miter shears. I'll link these below, they're from Amazon and I love them, they cut through everything. And I just cut off that end piece, and then if you're going to be using this outside and staking it into the ground, you will need one more stake. So I took that from one of the other fence posts and then I just hot glued it down and adhered it to our current fence post. The galvanized bunny that is going to be the centerpiece of this DIY actually came from another Dollar Tree sign. I'll definitely be repurposing this sign for a future DIY, but for now, I just peeled off the galvanized bunny and we're going to be using him on the center. Starting in with some embellishments, I took this green and white garland from the Dollar Tree and I'm just wrapping it around the fence like a vine. If you can't find any of this garland, you could use some greenery, some florals, or even some jute. I wanted this to look like a garden fence or a garden gate. I was definitely going for farmhouse secret garden vibes. So to achieve this, I took these gorgeous floral picks that came out recently at the Dollar Tree, and I'm just clipping them into 3 different sections and playing around with how I like them laid out. And I quickly realized that there was no way the bunny was going to lay flat on top of these, so I just flipped the fence over, and then I hot glued the florals to the back, and that way we have a good flat surface to later adhere our galvanized bunny onto. Now that our florals are secure behind the fence, I am taking some hot glue and just adhering the bunny to the front. And I really liked the way that this came out, not only for practical purposes, but it kind of looks like the bunny escaped the garden because he's on the other side of all the flowers. Or maybe he's being mischievous and trying to get in to eat the flowers. Who knows, but either way, I think it came out really cute. And to add a bit more of a farmhouse feel, and to dirty it up because this is supposed to look like it's the fence to a garden, I took some brown paint and just distressed all around. If you're going to be using this DIY outside, then at this point you are done and ready to stake it down into the ground. But if you're going to be using it inside like me, you're going to take some miter shears or some industrial strength scissors and cut off the stakes before adhering it down onto the wood plank. And I forgot to do this, so you will see me figure that out a little bit later on the video, but I wanted to let you know in the voiceover that you do want to cut off those pointy stakes before you glue it down onto the wood plank. And now I'm just covering up the area that I hot glued and the entire bed of the wood plank with some Spanish moss. And after I added all of that Spanish moss, I just took a tiny pair of scissors to trim up any areas. And I realized that there was a large blank space in between where our fence was and the moss, which I then realized was because I forgot to take the stakes off, so I put a flower there. And then it dawned on me that, oh yeah, I need to cut these off. So I went back in with those same miter shears from earlier, and I just cut off that little section and cut off down below. And then I was able to hot glue our fence properly onto our wood plank. And it just took a little bit of messing around with the Spanish moss, but it all worked out. Hot glue fixed everything, and I was able to get that back into a place that I liked. And those are all the steps you need to recreate your own garden gate bunny. Let me know in the comments down below if you plan to use this outside or inside. The next DIY is a piece of spring home decor that uses a pizza pan from the Dollar Tree. Here are the other supplies you'll need to make it. We are starting off this DIY by taking a pizza pan, yes, a pizza pan from the Dollar Tree. I know these can be a little bit hard to find. I know some people find them really easy, some people don't see them in their Dollar Trees. But you could also they have the oven trays that go in the oven for baking, so one of those would also work. It's a tiny bit smaller, but not too much. Then I am taking some white chalk paint and I am just covering the entirety of our pizza pan. And I'm doing it kind of messy because I want some of that silver pan to be showing through. So I'm just going through with about 2 coats of this white paint. To distress things up along the edges, I am taking a stippling brush from the Crafter Square section. I love this brush, and some dark brown paint and just going all around the edges and then lightly through the entire center of our pizza pan just to dirty things up and make it a little bit more farmhouse looking. The Dollar Tree sells this nautical rope. You could also get some of the tube mesh ribbon. They sell that in a brown color and that would work too. Or you can go with a bright color for Easter. But all that I'm doing with this nautical rope is hot gluing it all the way around the center part of our pizza pan, basically where the lip meets the middle. And I just hot glued it down. To decorate our pizza pan decor piece, I am taking this Happy Easter sign from the Dollar Tree. And I liked the jute ribbon, but I thought that I could double up my own jute. So I am basically just going to be using these carrots, and if you know me, you know that I do not like glitter. So I went ahead and sanded the glitter off and sanded both of the carrots to give it more of a farmhouse feel, and then took that same stippling brush and some brown paint to just dirty up my carrots so it looks like you just picked them. Then I did end up making my own jute bows and hot gluing those back down into place. When I sanded off all the glitter, it also made the Happy Easter a little bit more difficult to read. So I took some of this off-white paint that I had and a paintbrush, and I just went over the lettering with that white paint so that the Happy Easter would really pop. To match the green on our carrot tops, I wanted to have a green bow. So I took some of this green ribbon, and how I make my bigger bows is I create a loop and then I just cinch it in the middle and tie it with either jute or even a zip tie would work. Then I add on my tail, and you could leave it just with the jute, and I really like how that bow comes out. It looks very rustic, but to make it a little bit more farmhouse, I just add a knot with my bow by taking another piece of some scrap green ribbon, and then I just hot glue it to the back. After adhering the bow down, it's time to add my little bunny. So to cut off the wood dowel part of him, I am taking these miter shears that I got off Amazon. I'll link them down below. I absolutely love them. They cut through everything. And I'm just kind of laying out where all of my little embellishments are going to go. And before I hot glue them down, I just wanted to stage them to see how I liked it. Then I'm taking my hot glue and starting off with the carrots and adhering those down. And I felt like I needed a little bit more down by my bunny. There was too much extra space, so I added a bit of Spanish moss, and then I glued down the carrots and the bunny. I love this DIY because it's so quick and easy, and you can customize it to fit your style. The next DIY is a bunny trail sign. This works great inside and outside as well. Here's what you need to recreate it. For this DIY, I am taking a wood arrow sign that I found in the Crafter Square section of the Dollar Tree. And I actually originally intended to use this for a different project that didn't end up working out, so that's why it's already painted white. But I went ahead and painted it with one more coat of a brighter white. And then I took a stippling brush, also from the Crafter Square section, and went all around the edges with a dark brown paint to just dress up the sign. To write our bunny trail sign, there are lots of different options you can use. The Dollar Tree has these great poster stickers, and they also have so many different types of rub-on transfers. And if you're one of the lucky few who has really good handwriting or maybe knows a bit of calligraphy, you can go ahead and just freehand it. I ended up using a vinyl decal, so that's what you're about to see with some of this editing magic. This sign is inspired by a Ray Dunn one of the same name. That is quite a bit more expensive, so I had a lot of fun trying to recreate it using only Dollar Tree items. I found these great carrot stickers. They're so cute and they're made of felt. These came in a pack of 12 at the Dollar Tree, so I'm using 2 of them and just putting them to the left of Bunny. You could absolutely be done with the DIY here, but I thought it might be even cuter made into a stake sign. So I just took a paint stick and some white paint that we used on the arrow and just painted the entire paint stick, and I did end up taking a tiny bit of brown paint and just dressing it as well. I taped back the hanger on our arrow sign instead of cutting it because you never know if I change my mind and want to use it as a hanging sign. So I just taped that down and then added a bit of hot glue in our paint stick, and that's how I adhered the arrow to the stick. I ended up using this DIY inside by placing it in a pot with a fake plant, but I think this would look really cute outside as well, maybe in a garden. The next DIY is a wine glass turned bunny tea light holder. Here's everything that you'll need to make this DIY on your own. To start off this adorable bunny DIY, we are going to take some white paint and paint the inside of our wine glass. I've seen this craft done quite a few times at different craft fairs, but they've always been pretty expensive, so I wanted to recreate it in an affordable way using Dollar Tree supplies. So in keeping with our Dollar Tree theme, I've never personally seen burlap sold at the Dollar Tree. There might be. But I have seen burlap ribbon. So to make our bunny ears, I am taking some burlap ribbon and I am just cutting out basically like a really long oval shape, trying to make our bunny ears. And I just eyeballed this, but if you wanted to be really precise and perfect, you could always take a pen or probably a piece of chalk, then you could erase the lines and trace out before you cut. But I just kind of went right in there and cut out my ears. I also wanted my bunny to have nice pink inside of her ears so that it matches her nose. So I took some pink paint. This is Ballet Slipper by Waverly, and I am just painting a smaller oval on the center area of our burlap ribbon ears. While the bunny ears dry, we're going to move on to our now dry wine glass and start making our bunny face. You can always use a Sharpie instead of black paint when you're making the whiskers and the eyes, but I really like the glossy finish of paint, so that's what I went with, and I just used black paint for the eyes and the same pink color that we used on the inside of the ears I'm using for the nose. And for the nose, I basically just drew a heart. That's the way that I like and thought it looked the cutest. And then I just added the little bunny mouth and the whiskers. By this point, my bunny ears have all dried, so I'm just taking them and trying to see where I best want to position them. You want them far enough down the glass that it fits with the bunny face, but you also don't want it too far down because then you're going to see a lot of the wine stem. So right in the middle, once you find that spot, you can go ahead and hot glue them down into place. Then I wanted to give my bunny a nice pretty bow, so I took this pastel plaid ribbon from the Dollar Tree, and I just made a really simple bow using jute to tie it in the center, and then I hot glued that to the center of our bunny's ears. This is a quick and easy Easter DIY using a lot of materials that you probably already have in your house. Thanks. The last DIY in today's video is a wildflower candle holder. Here's the supplies you need to recreate it. I'm using all Dollar Tree florals in this DIY, and I took 4 and placed them at 12 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 6 o'clock, and 9 o'clock, all around my glass jar. Then I went in with some shorter flowers, followed by some bits of greenery in between the spaces of the flowers. Then I had these bright purple and some white little buds that I also placed all around the glass jar. Although it's really hot glue holding up all of our flowers around the glass jar, I wanted to put some jute around the center of the glass jar so it looked like it was actually the jute holding up all of our flowers. I wrapped it around 4 times. Then I created a double loop bow with some jute. I just spread apart my index and middle finger, however wide apart that is going to determine how large or small your double bow is. Then you go over, under, and then with that little tail, you're going to go in between the V that has formed between your index and middle finger. Then after you have pulled it through the V, you're going to put it under that last little loop you had made over your middle finger and pull. There are tons of tutorials on how to make this bow on YouTube, so if I didn't explain it as easily or properly for you, you can go ahead and just YouTube search how to do a double loop bow. Then the last step was just hot gluing it on to the front of my candle and trimming off the tails. Thanks for watching my video. I'll be back next Thursday with a new DIY video for all of you. Until next time, keep searching, keep creating.